Arthur Bennett shoved his shoulder against the rotting wood of the doorframe, stumbling into the dark interior of the collapsed structure. His breath came in ragged, burning gasps, visible as white puffs in the freezing air. Outside, the world was a cacophony of distant mortar thuds and the biting wind, but inside, the silence was heavy and immediate. He didn't take a moment to admire the ruins. He scanned the room with the frantic intensity of a hunted animal. The building, once perhaps a bakery or a small shop, was now a hollowed-out shell. The ceiling had caved in on one side, allowing a pale beam of moonlight to illuminate the swirling dust motes that choked the air. He was alone, separated from his unit 3 blocks back. His radio was dead weight on his shoulder. Arthur wiped a layer of grime from his eyes, his boots crunching loudly on broken glass and fallen plaster. He needed a corner to rest, a vantage point to wait out the night. But as he moved deeper into the shadows, the metallic scent of copper hit him before he saw the source. It was a smell that every soldier knew, thick, sweet, and alarming. Arthur stopped. He raised his rifle, stepping over a pile of debris. There, wedged between a fallen support beam and a shattered counter, was a body. The man was face down, half buried in gray rubble. He wasn't moving. Arthur approached slowly, the barrel of his rifle fixed on the figure. There was no uniform visible, just tattered clothes coated in a layer of ash and mud so thick it rendered him colorless. He looked like part of the ruins, just another piece of wreckage left behind. Arthur nudged the man's boot with his own. Nothing. He knelt, slinging his rifle to his side, and gripped the man's shoulder to roll him over. The body was heavy, dead weight, but as Arthur turned him, a low, wet groan escaped his lips. He was alive. Arthur pulled a small tactical light from his vest, shielding the beam with his hand to avoid casting a glow outside. The bleeding had stopped, but the cold was becoming a new enemy. Arthur had dragged the man, he still didn't have a name for him, further into the back of the shop, behind the remains of a heavy industrial oven that shielded them from the wind in the street view. It was a tight squeeze. They were sitting shoulder to shoulder in the dark, the only sound being the stranger's ragged breathing and the distant rhythmic thumping of artillery miles away. Arthur sat with his back against the cold brick wall, cleaning the blood off his hands with a rag. He watched the man closely. The stranger had passed out from the pain during the treatment, but was now beginning to stir again. In the gloom, Arthur studied him. He was wearing heavy work trousers and a thick wool jacket that had been shredded by the explosion. Underneath, a gray shirt was soaked through with sweat and blood. He looked like any other military-aged male in the region. Civilian? Militia? Insurgent? It was impossible to tell. The stranger shifted, letting out a sharp gasp as consciousness returned. His hand immediately flew to his leg, feeling the tight pressure of the bandages. Then his eyes snapped to Arthur. He scrambled backward, his boots scraping against the floor, panic seizing him. He began to speak rapidly, his voice rising in pitch, a string of harsh, guttural words. "Hey, hey," Arthur whispered forcefully, holding his hands up, palms open. "Stop! Look at me!" The man pressed himself into the corner, his chest heaving. He looked at the rifle resting by Arthur's leg, then back at Arthur's face. He looked like a cornered wolf, ready to bite even if it meant death. "I patched you up," Arthur said, pointing to the leg. "You were bleeding out. I saved you." The stranger looked down at his leg, then back at Arthur. The panic didn't leave his eyes, but the aggression seemed to stall. He seemed confused. He touched the bandages, his fingers trembling, tracing the professional wrap of the gauze. He looked at the tourniquet, military grade. He looked at Arthur's uniform, his eyes narrowing. Arthur reached for his canteen. He unscrewed the cap and took a sip to show it was safe, then extended it. "Water. Drink." The man hesitated for a long moment. His lips were cracked and dry. Slowly, warily, he reached out. His hand was calloused, the nails dirty and broken. He took the canteen and drank deeply, water spilling down his chin. He handed it back, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. The dawn did not bring warmth. It only brought a cruel gray light that exposed the devastation of the city in high definition. Inside the bakery, the shadows that had offered Arthur a sense of ambiguous safety retreated, revealing the stark reality of his situation. He had barely slept, his eyes gritty with fatigue, his hand never leaving the pistol grip of his rifle. Across from him, the stranger was still unconscious, his breathing shallow but steady. The dawn light washed over the man, stripping away the mystery of the night. Now, Arthur could see the details he had missed in the chaos. The jacket the man wore was not just civilian wool. It was a tactical underlayer, high quality, designed for thermal regulation in harsh climates. The pants were reinforced at the knees. Driven by a gnawing suspicion that it started with the boots, Arthur crawled closer. He moved with the silence of a predator, inching toward the sleeping man. He needed to know. He needed to be sure. His hand hovered over the man's chest, then deftly slipped into the inner pocket of the torn jacket. His fingers brushed against a small, hard booklet. He pulled it out slowly, his heart hammering against his ribs. It was a military ID. The cover was stamped with a crimson crest, a hawk gripping a lightning bolt. It was the insignia of the Northern Coalition, the very army Arthur's unit had been fighting for 6 months. He opened it. The face in the photo was younger, clean-shaven, staring back with a stern, disciplined expression. The name was printed in a sharp foreign script, but the rank code was universal: Lieutenant. Arthur stared at the man. He wasn't a conscript. He wasn't a militia fighter caught in the crossfire. He was an officer of the enemy, a leader of the men who had been shelling Arthur's position for weeks. A wave of nausea hit Arthur. The rules of engagement were clear: capture or neutralize. He had done neither. He had used his own medical supplies to save a high-value target. He looked at the knife strapped to his own boot. The grim logic of war whispered in his ear.
By mid-morning, the city began to wake up, not with the bustle of life, but with the machinery of death. The sound of engines grew louder, vibrating through the floorboards of the ruined bakery. Arthur was pacing the small confines of their hideout like a caged animal. He checked his radio again. Still static. He was completely cut off. The wounded officer, Arthur had started calling him the lieutenant in his head, watched him. The animosity from earlier had settled into a tense, watchful guardedness. They were 2 wolves locked in a cage, neither willing to bite first. Suddenly, the sound of heavy boots crunching on gravel outside froze them both. Arthur dropped to a crouch, signaling frantically for the lieutenant to stay down. The voices drifted in through the shattered windows. They were loud, confident, and speaking the sharp, rhythmic language of the Northern Coalition. It was a sweep team. They were clearing buildings, looking for stragglers like Arthur. Arthur pressed his back against the side of the industrial oven, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might give away his position. He checked the magazine in his rifle. 12 rounds. If they came in, he could take 2 or 3, but he would die in this room. He looked at the lieutenant. The wounded man was sitting up, his head cocked toward the voices. His eyes lit up with recognition. These were his people. His salvation was 20 feet away. All he had to do was scream. All he had to do was shout for help, and his comrades would storm the building, kill Arthur, and rescue him. Arthur raised his weapon, aiming it not at the door, but directly at the lieutenant's head. His eyes pleaded silently, "Don't do it." The lieutenant looked at the barrel of the gun, then at the door. He could scream before Arthur pulled the trigger, or maybe Arthur would shoot and they would both die. It was a gamble. The footsteps stopped right outside the bakery door. Someone kicked a piece of debris. A voice shouted something close, likely asking if the building had been checked. Arthur's finger tightened on the trigger. He prepared himself for the end. The lieutenant took a deep breath.
He looked at Arthur, his eyes locking on to the panic and the desperation in the American's face. He looked at the bandage on his leg.
The adrenaline of the morning patrol had faded, leaving behind a silence that was even heavier than before. The room felt smaller now. The dust had settled, coating both men in a uniform shade of gray, making them look like statues carved from the ruins themselves. But statues didn't need water, and Arthur was parched. His canteen was lighter than it should have been. He had given the last significant swig to the lieutenant hours ago. Thirst in a war zone is a specific kind of torture. It starts as a dryness in the throat, then evolves into a headache that pounds behind the eyes, and finally it becomes a desperate, singular focus that overrides fear. Arthur shook his canteen. It sloshed pitifully, maybe 2 mouthfuls left. He looked at the lieutenant. The enemy officer was pale, his lips cracked and bleeding. The blood loss had dehydrated him rapidly. If he didn't drink soon, the infection breeding in his leg wouldn't matter. His kidneys would shut down first. Arthur stood up, his knees popping. He checked his rifle, then looked down at the wounded man. "I have to go out," Arthur said, pantomiming the action of drinking. "Water. I need to find water." The lieutenant looked up, his eyes glassy. He understood. He looked at the door, then back at Arthur, and gave a weak, almost imperceptible nod. It was a terrifying moment of trust. Arthur was leaving him defenseless. If Arthur didn't come back, if he was killed, or if he simply decided to abandon this burden, the lieutenant would die a slow, lonely death in this concrete tomb. Arthur hesitated at the door. He turned back and placed his secondary knife, a small folding blade, on the floor within the lieutenant's reach. It wasn't much, but it was a gesture. It said, "I am coming back." Stepping out into the street was like stepping on the surface of the moon. The sun was high now, casting harsh shadows over the craters and twisted metal. Arthur hugged the walls, moving with slow, deliberate steps. He wasn't looking for a fight, he was looking for a miracle. He bypassed the main road, slipping into the alleyways where the shadows offered concealment. He checked the ruins of a cafe, dry. He checked a smashed vending machine, looted. 2 blocks away, he found it.
By nightfall, the truce between the two men was being tested by a new enemy, biology. The temperature in the ruins had plummeted again, but the lieutenant was burning up. The infection, fertilized by the dirt of the floor and the severity of the trauma, had entered his bloodstream. Arthur sat by his side, listening to the man's breathing change from a rhythmic wheeze to short, sharp gasps. The lieutenant was shivering violently, his teeth chattering with a sound that seemed deafening in the quiet room. Arthur took off his own tactical jacket, his primary layer of warmth, and draped it over the enemy officer. It was a foolish tactical decision. If he had to run, he would freeze. If he had to fight, he was less protected. But he couldn't watch the man shake apart. Around midnight, the delirium set in. The lieutenant started muttering. At first, it was unintelligible mumbles, low and soft. Then it became louder. He was speaking in his native tongue, his voice laced with urgency. He wasn't in the bakery anymore. In his mind, he was somewhere else. "Elena," the lieutenant whispered, his hand reaching out into the empty air, grasping at invisible fingers. "Elena, no!" Arthur watched, transfixed. He didn't know the name, but he knew the tone. It was the tone of a man talking to someone he loved. A wife? A sister? A daughter? Suddenly, the enemy wasn't just a rank and a uniform. He was a man with a name who had people waiting for him, people who would mourn him if he died in this dust-choked room. The lieutenant suddenly thrashed, crying out in panic. He tried to sit up, his eyes wide, but seeing nothing of the reality around him. "Get down! Get down!" he shouted in his own language, the command clear even if the words weren't. Arthur lunged forward, pinning the lieutenant's shoulders to the ground. "Shh! You have to be quiet," Arthur hissed, looking fearfully at the entrance. "Quiet! You're safe!" The lieutenant fought him. He was weak, but the fever gave him a frantic, hysterical strength. He gripped Arthur's combat vest, pulling him close. The sun rose like a bruised eye over the horizon, casting a sickly purple light through the cracks in the bakery walls. Arthur had spent the last few hours watching the rise and fall of the lieutenant's chest, counting the seconds between breaths. The fever had not broken. If anything, it had tightened its grip. The officer's skin was gray, clammy, and the red streaks radiating from the wound on his leg were climbing higher, dark tendrils of infection seeking the heart. Arthur stood up, his joints protesting with a sickening pop. He knew the geography of this city from the briefing maps he had memorized days ago. There was an old cathedral 6 blocks east. It had been designated as a neutral aid station by an NGO before the shelling intensified. It was likely abandoned now, stripped of supplies, but it would have something this bakery didn't: clean space, perhaps lingering medical alcohol, and thicker walls. Staying here meant watching the man die slowly of sepsis. Moving him meant risking a bullet in the street. It wasn't a tactical choice, it was a human one. Arthur knelt beside the lieutenant and shook him gently. "Hey, wake up." The man's eyelids fluttered open. The eyes were hazy, struggling to focus on Arthur's face. He tried to speak, but his throat was too dry. "We have to move," Arthur said, keeping his voice low and level. "You can't stay here. The infection is spreading." The lieutenant looked around, confusion clouding his features before the pain of his leg anchored him back in reality. He looked at Arthur, then at the door. He understood the risk. To go outside was to enter the hunting ground. He shook his head weakly, gripping Arthur's sleeve. He was trying to say no, trying to save Arthur the trouble of dragging a corpse through a war zone. "I'm not asking," Arthur grunted. He pulled the lieutenant's arm over his shoulder. "On 3. 1, 2, 3.
They were crossing a wide, debris-strewn avenue, the most dangerous part of the journey, when the crack of the rifle shot tore through the air. It was a singular, sharp sound, distinct from the dull thud of artillery. Crack! Then the hiss of the bullet passing inches from Arthur's ear, followed by the explosion of concrete dust on the wall behind them. "Sniper!" Arthur roared. Adrenaline, sharp and electric, flooded his system. He didn't think, he reacted. He threw himself and the lieutenant to the ground, sliding behind the rusted chassis of a burnt-out bus. The lieutenant groaned as he hit the pavement, the impact sending shockwaves of agony through his shattered leg. Arthur pressed his back against the cold metal of the wheel well, his chest heaving. He scanned the buildings across the avenue. High windows, shadows, 1,000 places to hide a man with a scope. "Did you see it?" Arthur barked, looking down at the lieutenant. The officer was clutching his leg, teeth gritted so hard Arthur thought they might shatter. He shook his head. He was barely conscious, the pain of the fall compounding the fever. Crack! Another shot. This one pinged off the metal frame of the bus, inches above Arthur's head. The sniper had them pinned. They were trapped in the middle of the street, with 50 yards of open ground between them and the safety of the alley on the other side. Arthur looked at the angle. The shots were coming from the northwest, a high-rise. He looked at the lieutenant. The man was fading. His eyes were rolling back. If they stayed here, the sniper would just wait for them to move or call in a mortar team to finish the job. If they ran, they would be cut down. Arthur checked his tactical vest. He had 1 smoke grenade left. 1. He pulled the canister from his pouch, his thumb hovering over the pin. He looked at the enemy officer, the man whose army was likely the one shooting at them right now. It was a cruel irony. The sniper probably thought he was shooting at 2 Americans, or perhaps he didn't care. To the scope, they were just targets, heat signatures in the cold. "Listen to me," Arthur said, grabbing the lieutenant's collar, pulling him close. "I'm going to pop smoke, and when I do..." The cathedral loomed out of the fog like the skeletal remains of a giant beast. Its roof was largely gone, blown away by shelling weeks prior, but the thick stone walls remained, ancient and stubborn.
Arthur and the lieutenant stumbled through the heavy oak doors, collapsing onto the cool flagstones of the nave. The silence here was different. It wasn't the tense, predatory silence of the streets. It was a hollow, sacred stillness. Shafts of gray light pierced through the holes in the roof, illuminating the swirling dust like pillars of smoke. Arthur dragged the lieutenant toward the altar, where the remains of pews had been pushed together to form a makeshift barricade. "We made it," Arthur rasped, his lungs burning. He eased the officer down against the stone steps of the chancel. The lieutenant was in bad shape. The run through the smoke had drained the last of his reserves. His face was ashen, his eyes sunken and dark. He looked up at the shattered stained glass window above them, where a headless saint looked down upon the ruins. He seemed to be making his peace with God, or perhaps just with the end. Arthur knelt beside him, checking the bandages. The bleeding had restarted, soaking the fabric dark red. Arthur cursed silently. He had no more gauze, no more water. He was useless here. "You need a medic," Arthur said, his voice echoing in the vast chamber. "A real one." The lieutenant looked at him. The fever was clouding his gaze, but he reached out, his cold hand gripping Arthur's wrist with surprising strength. He pulled Arthur closer. With his other hand, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small silver object. It was a lighter, engraved with initials. He pressed it into Arthur's palm. "Go," the lieutenant whispered. The word was clear. Arthur froze. "I'm not leaving." 3 days later, Sergeant Arthur Bennett sat in a sterile, fluorescent-lit debriefing room inside the forward operating base. The hum of the air conditioning was a stark contrast to the wind and artillery of the city. He was clean, shaved, and fed. The physical dirt of the ruins had been scrubbed away, but the mental grime felt tattooed onto his brain. He had told the intelligence officers a simplified version of the truth. He had been separated, pinned down, and had evaded capture by moving through the neutral zones. He omitted the bakery. He omitted the medical supplies used on an enemy. He omitted the lieutenant. "Bennett, take a look at this," the intelligence officer said, clicking a remote. A projector screen flickered to life on the wall. It showed drone footage of the cathedral ruins. The timestamp was from 2 days ago. The footage showed a medical convoy extracting a stretcher from the church. "We intercepted some comms from the Northern Coalition," the officer said, tapping the screen with a pen. "You were close to this sector. We missed a big fish. That man on the stretcher, that's Lieutenant Victor Kogan, son of General Kogan, the commander of the entire Northern Front." Arthur felt the blood drain from his face. The room seemed to tilt. The lieutenant, Victor, the man whose life he had saved, wasn't just a soldier. He was the son of the man orchestrating the war against them. "Intel says he was found alone, severely wounded but stable," the officer continued, shaking his head in frustration. "If we had found him, if we had captured him, we could have leveraged a prisoner swap for 50 of our guys, maybe even forced a ceasefire negotiation, but he slipped through our fingers." Arthur stared at the grainy image of the figure on the stretcher. He saw the bandaged leg. He saw the life he had fought so hard to protect. Guilt crashed over him like a wave. By saving one man, had he condemned others? Had he